Love and longing. The end of today's training had coincided nicely with nap time. Not that every little girl was taking that one lying down. Granted, none of them could take anything sitting up without help yet, however. Fina Noir and Dre Noir were more or less allergic to behaving. When you wanted to play, they wanted nothing to do with you. When you wanted them to calm down and sleep, it was playtime. Which of course leads to more problems, as they also had the habit of keeping their sisters up. Unfortunately for them, Daddy had figured out a few tricks to get around their mischief-making, tricks that the dark forest was silently amused by and was being gladly learned by the rest. Tiny flower crowns that dull sound coming in, but not going, means you can keep an ear on your sleeping babies without their sisters waking them up, no matter how fussy they get. Fina. No, Vernon says as he catches his second hatched blonde daughter's hand before she can smack her sister in the head. Then he stops DRI from hitting back. None of that from you either, DRI. Play nice. They just won't settle, will they? Mira Noir asks from the next room as the sound of chopping for a slow-cooked dinner sounds out. They're either going to expend all this energy as little babies and be the calmest girls in the galaxy, or I'm going to need to tag in every sorcerer alive to keep up with these little sweeties. Heaven forbid our children outpace us, Mira Noir teases. Well, they already have your good looks and dodged everything unfavorable from my side, so they'll at least be as strong as their mother, which means we're going to need an army to keep them corralled. Oh, stop! Mira Noir scolds him. Her tone, however, is delighted. Just the truth, my dear. Just the truth, Vernon says as he tickles Dre Noir's stomach after moving her a little ways away from her sister to make sure the flailing with her limbs wouldn't have any collateral damage. The tiny brunette laughs gleefully, and her little feet smack into his wrist through their little soft yellow baby booties. Fina Noir then starts making little you sounds, and he knows what that means. The little baby lets out a squeal of happiness as he picks her up and holds her to sit mostly upright on his lap. Her head is still supported, and she squirms in energetic excitement. Her tiny horns are thankfully nowhere near sharp enough to actually catch in his shirt, but they do catch her attention, and she tries to mess with him through the horns. She's a sharp point away from goring Daddy. Of course, seeing Fina have her fun means DRI wants in on it, and she starts making the U sound, which only means one thing: up. With Fina in his left arm and DRI in his right, Vernon is far from surprised when the sisters start kicking at each other even as they shake their heads to mess with him through their horns. He lets out a soft laugh and they start babbling at each other. Already his children are play fighting. They can't even sit up on their own, and they're ready to go. He looks up and smiles as Mira Noir takes a moment to swoop at the doorway and snap a picture of the fight on her communicator. What do you think a good caption would be? Never nap time? No to naps? Either way, Mother will love this. Mira Noir notes, and Vernon lets out a soft chuckle that has his daughters try to mimic it. Daddy defeated might be a good one, he adds. Oh, I plan to use that one when they start crawling all over you. I can already imagine the pile of adorable little Apuk just pinning you to the ground, Mira Noir says as she returns to placing the last bits of dinner in the slow cooker. Well, it does take a small legion of princesses to fell a sorcerer. Generally, we use more than sheer, overwhelming cuteness. Perhaps that's a good thing. It wouldn't do for my Mira Noir to be wed to be a Moro or some other sorcerers. Vernon teases, and she reappears in the doorway and waves a large serving spoon at him reprovingly. He playfully shrinks into himself a bit and is then forced to catch as Fina tries to lunge at DRI. None of that! Play nice! He scolds the babe as his axiom catches the baby in motion as gently as is possible while still stopping the movement. It shows up every now and again in children, Mira Noir says, and he looks up questioningly. Some are simply more efficient at drawing in axiom to sustain them. Fina and DRI are talented in the field and will easily have all the energy they could ever want. Well, good thing we know how to do that manually. Lets us pep ourselves up when we need it. Vernon says as he does just that and feels the energy dance under his skin like a blanket of static just waiting to be used. Nooga, 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 he gushes as he buries his face in Fina's stomach and makes funny noises to the absolute delight of the baby. He then turns for Dree's turn. A booga booga boo. Then he stops as he feels the forest shift ever so slightly. Someone's coming. Sorcery? Mironoir asks. Seems to be. Would you mind, my love? He asks, and she sweeps in to pluck both of the overly energetic babes out of his lap and arms. Thank you. He rises up and quickly gives Mironoir a kiss before heading outside to the backyard. Morg Arkun is waiting for him. What's going on? I thought you were on Lilb to Lelb. Has something happened in the Bright Forest? He asks curiously. Yes and no. Things are going well, but we need a bit more in the way of help. Certainly. What do you need? That trick of yours? The one where you can make anything from anything? I haven't been able to really get that down. Well, the first step is picking up the trick where you repair things if you have all the parts. Yes, I know. You taught me that, but I don't know how to extend it into straight-up conjuring things into existence and not just some kind of solid hallucination that quickly fades away. All right, take a seat. I'll walk you through it. Vernon offers, and from below them both the roots of the nearest tree thicken and grow strong. They rise up high enough to be used as stools and are quickly covered in soft moss. Both men sit and Vernon smiles. Step 1. A basic understanding of a concept of physics. Everything is composed of energy and space. The things that make a living tree different from a puff of air or a star is just the pattern of space and energy inside them. Understand? This is very basic. Yes, I understand. I learned this as a child, before I went to the dark forest. Morg Arkin says, and Vernon nods. Excellent. Now it's just step 1. Step 2 is where things get tricky. You need to understand that as everything is energy and space, it's also patterns and structure. It's an order of magnitude easier to use this understanding to make a brick of gold than it is to make a single functional pair of scissors. But that's not to say the gold brick is easy to make either. You not only have to consider the energy and space of the atomic structure of an atom of gold, but you have to think about the molecular structure as well and then the architectural structure of the brick. Without mnemonics and shortcuts, this technique is slow, impractical, and takes far too long to get far too few useful results. Isn't a mnemonic a mental shortcut? Morg Arkin asks, and Vernon nods. Yes, but it's very different from the second type of shortcut I use. The mnemonic just has me go through all the steps, in order and automatically. The shortcut itself is where this technique actually becomes practical. Vernon says as he reaches into his pocket and out of a tiny marking stitched into the lining, he draws a clamshell case he then opens. Inside are numerous tiny pins made of different metals that are holding down samples of cloth, plastic, and rubber, which in turn are holding down small samples of numerous types of crystal. Behold my cheat sheet. Samples? It's that simple? Morg Arkin asks as Vernon hands him the case for him to examine. Yes and no. You see, it's far too complicated and, to be frank, outright unreasonable to expect someone to memorize the complete molecular structure of an item, let alone memorize so many atomic structures. So, you make shortcuts and mnemonics. My first 2 were converting water to my own blood and the blood of my enemies into the acid of my stomach. Notice, when I was still mastering the technique I changed liquids to liquids and liquids I had an enormous sample of at all times. You humans, even your bodies are weapons. Morg Arkin says somewhat incredulously. He'd forgotten about the stomach acid. Coming from the fire-breathing turtle monster with a tendency to crusade and quest? Fair, Morg Arkin says, as he chuckles a bit and runs his hand down the tiny pins. Axiom ride? Brute Archna silk? Protein? This must have cost a fair amount to make. The benefits of being on a research team, official or not. You get funds to try crazy things, especially if they're interesting as well, Vernon says, and Morg Arkin hands the case back. Very true. Is what you explained really all there is to it? I'm afraid it's all that can be explained, but there's a lot that can be observed and then only explained in the way I already have. Technomancy is like that. Every field we've invented so far is very easy to explain or summarize, but ruthlessly hard to actually make into something practical. But when you get there, you have a ridiculously powerful tool at your disposal. My own is transmutation. Franklin has destruction, and the latest branch by Moden Maji could be described as divination, but more accurately as probability manipulation or tychokinesis, maybe synchronicity. That's my vote at any rate. We're still working on a name. I get destruction, I think, but probability manipulation. There's a tiny chance, every so tiny that every time your heart beats it might rip itself apart, Vernon says, and Morg Arkin eyes widen at the implication. You have an indirect reality alterer on your team? Asks the nigh unstoppable force of nature that takes several army killers working in tandem to slow down in a fight. All right, fair enough. Still, you humans move fast and far. We sent the best of the very best. We have slackers and civilians like any other species. You just haven't had a chance to meet any of them yet, Vernon says with a chuckle. Still, back on target, you're here to learn how I transmute and how to do it yourself. The explanation isn't really enough, so I'm going to transmute a whole bunch of things and you're going to pay attention. Then I'm going to walk you through it a few times. Sound fair? Very much so. So how do we start? Morg Arkin asks, and a pair of pebbles launch up from the ground. Vernon catches them and hands one to Morg. Rocks? The basics need to start somewhere, Vernon says, placing the still open case of samples on Morg's knee and pointing to one of them. Iron. He slowly pulls the axiom around him and begins reshaping things within the pebble. Feel the axiom nudging the electrons, protons, and neutrons. Remember that it's mostly empty space as everything falls back into place, and then he holds up the tiny nugget of pure iron. Did you follow that? Morg Arkin raises an eyebrow and focuses on his own pebble. You did something near the end of it that he has a lump that's mostly limestone with a small pocket of iron in it. Oh? Oh, sorry. It's one of those things that seems so obvious to me and is automatic now, Vernon says as he shifts the iron nugget back into limestone in his hand. Now, there's a sort of mental muscle memory for a complete transformation. It's best described as rolling the pattern, I think. My mental imprint is like a big circular newspaper press and its rollers. You may need something else, something that copies things en masse to do the same thing over and over. Over and over again. Morg Arkin considers before he suddenly grins, and the stone in his hand goes from a chunk of limestone with a tiny mote of iron into a lump of iron. He then raises an eyebrow and focuses. It shifts back after a few moments. A thumbprint works better. It's the same thing time after time, and it's right there. Whatever works for you, Vernon says, and Morg Arkin nods. And you have the basics for changing the compounds of things. After that, you need to study how things are made, which is a lot easier in my opinion, especially if you have a sample of something. This is a lot more complicated than I first thought. The forest does a lot to help us sorcerers out. This is something it's fairly new at. But it's learning. I can feel it. It is. That's the deal. The forest helps you grow and nurtures you, and in turn you help it grow and nurture it. A fair bargain. Very fair, Morg Arkin says. This is going to take a lot longer than I thought to really get down. He then brushes his finger against a sample of rubber in the case and focuses on the stone again. It takes a full 5 minutes of eye-poppingly intense glaring, but it shifts to vulcanized rubber. That was harder than I thought. The example I gave you made it easier. I can walk you through the... No, I think this is the point. I need to figure out how to make this work for me and with me, not how it works for you. Thank you, though, Morgarkin says, and he closes the case to give back to Vernon. Vernon takes it, then starts pulling noticeably on the axiom. What are you... The small chunk of limestone in his hand grows and expands as Vernon adds onto it before it suddenly shifts and wavers, taking a form identical to the clamshell case. Vernon then opens them both. They're identical. He closes them and gives the one Morgarkun handed him right back. You're letting me have the original? The original isn't even on this planet. You have the copy of a copy's copy, Vernon says, and Morgarkin sighs. So you just keep the copy each time, he asks, and Vernon nods. Well, I'm glad I got in early before that explanation took 20 minutes I'll never get back. Vernon just chuckles at that as he pockets the copy he just made. Anyways, best of luck, Morgarkin. Technomancy is hard to master no matter what branch, but it lets you do some pretty crazy things. Indeed, thank you, Morgarkun says, holding out his hand. Vernon shakes it and he smiles. Good to know I understand that gesture. I have to go now. It takes a bit to reattune to the bright forest. Best of luck, Vernon says, and Morgarkin is gone in a woodwalk. The large roots pull back into the ground and the moss integrates into the roots. He then re-enters the house just in time for a pair of shimmering green eyes to crack open for a moment, regard him, and then go back to their nap. He softly kisses Umanoir on the head as the tiny bundle of joy starts to lightly snore,